All right, so the essay was the moral argument for God's existence. Was there anything that stood out to anybody or was confusing or particularly enjoyed? I remember this morning, Scott, you mentioned that you had something you wanted to discuss.
Mine's completely off-topic, inspired by this, so I'll save it for later.
One thing that I wanted to point out was the first header: objective moral values exist, they are properly basic. So in that section, really he's talking about two things without making a distinction. So what I want to do, hopefully, is to make that distinction clear for you so that you can have a more comprehensive understanding of the moral argument. But I suppose before I get into that, let's back up a little bit further. In the first, where is it? In the first two paragraphs, the second paragraph, he says, I will argue that if objective moral values exist, then God exists, semicolon, objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. So without explicitly stating it, that is that's what's known as a syllogism. So if you were in On Guard, we discussed syllogisms and what they are and how they're helpful for discussions in apologetics or rhetoric in general. So maybe let's write that out. We could put it on the whiteboard. So he says, "Do not have a marker." Oh, yeah. Is there a marker for you? Yeah. It's dry erase, okay. I guess I could just put it on the screen. Probably easier than writing it.
There's a syllogism, one of those reasonable faith PDFs talk about.
No, so a syllogism is a...
I mean, do they have it in one of the On Guard PowerPoints you got?
Yeah, so I have the syllogism of the moral argument from Dr. Craig, but I want to compare the two. So this one is if objective moral values exists, then God exists.
Move your camera there.
Yes. Thank you. So if objective moral values exist, then God exists. Objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. So a syllogism is like a mathematical equation. It's a tool used in propositional logic for making a case. So this is what the syllogism looks like, and it's exactly the structure that Dr. Copan gives in the essay. He says, if objective moral values exist, then God exists. Right? Premise 2, objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. Right? This is as basic as the argument can get. And when you're making a good argument, you want to consider, are the premises more plausible, or are they more plausibly true than false? So consider each premise. If objective moral values exist, then God exists. Is that true? And then the second premise, objective moral values do exist. Is that true? Well, if both premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then necessarily the third the conclusion, God exists, is true. And so that's in a nutshell what the moral argument is. This syllogism, I want to throw a little bit of Latin at you, follows the modus ponens: if A, then B, A, therefore B. That's what this argument is. That's the structure that this argument is taking. Its counterpart is known as modus tollens, which is if not A, then not B, A, therefore B. So the version of that for this looks like this. If God does not exist, then there are no objective moral values and duties. There are objective moral values and duties. therefore God does exist. So that's kind of the inverse modus tollens version of the argument that Dr. Copan is giving here. So there's one word that I want to highlight here in particular, which is objective. Is there anybody that can tell me what objective means?
The difference is you have two words, subjective and objective.
Right.
Subjective means, depending on your opinion, your perspective. Objective means it's concrete.
Fact.
This cup exists. It is an object. So it's objective reality.
Yeah.
The truth is external to yourself.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say next, is the truth of the statement is shifted from me, the subject, to the object, or in this case, moral values and duties, or God. So again, these two words are objective and subjective. Objective is facts. They're person independent, things like laws of nature or statistics. So if we were to ask, who is the oldest person alive, there is an absolute answer to that. It's not a matter of opinion. I don't know who it is, but we could find someone who is on Earth right now, and they are the oldest person alive. Conversely, there's subjective, which is opinion-based. It's dependent on the person, and that would be things like, what is the best flavor ice cream?
Or the most mature person on Earth.
Yeah, or the most mature, most intelligent person, or things like that. It's more of a matter of opinion.
It's not that subjective. It's clearly vanilla.
So the reason we're talking about this is when we consider things like morality, ethics, justice. Is that just a matter of opinion, or is that true for everyone, everywhere, no matter what?
That is...
Depends on what you ask.
Yeah, that is a somewhat ambiguous discussion.
How so?
Well, because I think there are arguments that are presented on both sides of that. Now, I don't think everyone agrees that there are moral absolutes. I think the vast majority of people agree with that, and I certainly believe that. But there is people that will argue that point.
So that leads me to another thing that I want to make a distinction between, and that is ontology and epistemology. So let me ask you the question before I get into that. When you're talking about morality with someone, and you're talking about whether it's true for everyone, everywhere, always, or if it's only true for some people but is different for others, I imagine the immediate response that someone would give is, well, what about like psychopaths? They have no moral intuition. They don't have that small still voice in their heart that tells them, oh, this is right or this is wrong. And that's something that Dr. Copan appeals to in this essay. He talks about how something is properly basic. That's a philosophical term from the branch of epistemology that deals with whether a belief requires other beliefs in order for it to be true. So that has to do with your ability to know something, right? So if something is properly basic, then you don't need evidence to support your belief that, for example, 2 + 2 = 4. Well, prove that 2 + 2 = 4. You don't have to, because it's self-evident. That's what properly basic means. So in this header here, he says objective moral values exist. They are properly basic. So that's actually communicating both ontology and epistemology. The ontological aspect of it is that moral values and duties exist, independent of anybody to actually enforce them or practice them or understand them. The other half is that they are properly basic, meaning we can understand them. We have mental access to moral values and duties. We can know about them. And so I want to try to clarify that our ability to know moral values and duties is independent of the fact that they exist. And so, with that in mind, how would you respond to the objection, well, what about psychopaths? Doesn't that undermine the
Well, one thing that I have heard that objection, I've heard argument to it, which is, I think very clear, is to the psychopath, say there's no objective morality. Well, you take something from them, quite often you get a reaction indicating that they understand that that's wrong. So they are selective in which they choose to respect, but they have those values.
Well, let's say that they still reject that it's wrong. Does that? I guess the question I'm getting at is, does that undermine the truth of moral? The existence of moral values and duties. What I'm getting at is this: just because someone is unable to perceive them doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And so that's why I want to clarify this difference between the reality of moral values and duties and the knowability. So
a blind person may not understand
exactly
color.
that's exactly what I was going to say. So just because someone's blind and they can't perceive, light doesn't mean that just color doesn't exist. Well, just because they can't perceive it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It exists independent of their ability to know it. And so that's what I want to try to clarify here is that moral values and duties, morality exists independent of our ability to know and understand it. So, for example, if the Nazis had won World War II and either just brainwashed everybody or killed everyone who disagreed with them, would they still have been wrong? Would they still have been evil? Would they still have been murderers or
Might
haters?
makes right.
They would have been, right? They would have been wrong. Even if everyone on Earth agreed with the Nazis, it still would have been wrong to murder and all of the things that they, all the horrors that they committed. So, real quick, can we take a look at Hebrews 10:16? Does anybody have a Bible they want to take a look at? Hebrews 10:16.
I got it. This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, declares the Lord. I'll put my laws on their hearts and write them on their minds.
That last part there, I will put my laws on their hearts and write them on their
What was
minds.
that, Hebrews what?
10:16.
There's quite a bit of others too.
Yeah, there are a lot of
Hebrews
others, but that's a good one.
8, Hebrews 8:10, Romans 2:15-16.
Yep. So the reason I'm pointing to that is that we have this innate sense of right and wrong, and in the essay, Dr. Copan talks about how we have this sense of morality built into us, and how moral principles are discovered, not invented. And just like we trust, our sense of sight and sense of smell and a sense of touch to perceive the truth of the world around us, we also have this sense of right and wrong. It's like the sixth sense of morality that God has built into us. He's written His laws on our hearts, and that is what some would call an aspect of the image of God. We're endowed with the image of God, and so therefore we, like when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, they became aware of right and wrong, good and evil, good and bad. So does that help? Does that clarify the difference between the reality of moral values and duties? Morality exists independent of whether or not we're able to conceive of it, versus our actual ability to perceive and know what is right and wrong. Does that help? Were there any other parts of the essay that stood out to anybody? Or?
I do have a question. How are they discovered? Why are they discovered if you already have them?
So that's an argument against kind of God and them being written on our hearts. So they were discovered during evolution and help us prosper and to grow as tribes, and but that there's all kinds of different issues with that.
So we have a few ways of discovering and knowing right and wrong. A few examples are Scripture, divine revelation through Scripture. We have our moral intuition, our everyday experience. Like Scott was talking about, even a psychopath, if you were to steal his smartphone from him, he'd be like, "Hey, that's an injustice. You've wronged me," even though supposedly they don't have a sense of right and wrong. They still have a sense of their own value as a person. Like, I'm a person, therefore you can't just steal from me. Like, I have rights, I have value that is rooted in morality. So personal experience, has a lot of power in informing us of the reality of moral values and duties.
I'd say one thing that inhibits that is the hardening of hearts. Romans talks about God hardened their hearts, and I think that experience and corruption and sin deceives us and corrupts our conscience to the point where we don't see what's going on around us. I think of slavery in that regard. It was accepted and practiced for so long that it just became a part of deception until people started really thinking about it and realizing that, hey, even though this is practiced, this isn't right.
So the evolution of morality argument is they realized as tribes and early peoples that killing each other doesn't help you protect you from predators and from other people. And if you get together to kind of work things out, you can be stronger. But all of that, the whole entire argument is, it says they discovered morality and they learned morality, but it doesn't answer the question of, well, is it actually objectively true?
Right. So if the evolutionist is going to argue that evolution is what led to moral discoveries, what they're doing is they're smuggling in an objective standard. So if it's objective, meaning it's true for everyone everywhere, then that means it's fixed. And so if it's fixed, then surely it's something independent of what we say that it is. It's true regardless of whether or not we like it or not. Like again if the Nazis had won World War II and everybody all agreed with the same thing, does that suddenly make that true? No, because morality, moral values and duties exist objectively, meaning they're independent of what everybody thinks. So it's like 2 + 2 = 4 is true regardless of whether you like it or not, or regardless of whether everyone agrees that 2 + 2 is actually 5. It's still false because it exists independent of us as mental agents. So the reality, the ontology of moral values and duties exists independent of our ability to know it. So it's kind of the difference between whether or not something is necessarily true versus our certainty. So something can be necessarily true. For example, let's say hypothetically that there's a rock on some distant planet that just happens to be shaped like a heart. we don't know it, but nevertheless, it's true. On some distant planet, thousands of light years away, there's a rock shaped like a heart. We don't know that. We're not certain of it, but nevertheless, it is true. So maybe that's a poor analogy, but what I'm getting at is that the truth of it is independent of our ability to know and conceive of it. So we don't have to have certainty about it. And I think for morality, a lot of people struggle with, knowing with certainty because there's so much gray. It feels like there's so much. We're such limited, fallible creatures that because we don't have the answers perfectly every time, we feel like, well, it must be more subjective and complicated than we realize. It's not so black and white. The other thing is that I think a lot of people are intimidated by objectivity because they think that that's authoritarian. It's black and white. It's narrow-minded, and they think that I just don't want to be too imposing on other people. And I think that's just a false humility, I suppose, to try to say, well, if being right means that it comes at the cost of somebody else, then no one should be right, and that's a
Destructive.
yeah, that's self-destructive.
I loved his argument about, just because there's twilight doesn't mean we can't distinguish
Exactly,
between
yeah.
day and night.
Yeah.
I think that's, a good rule for so many things is there are borderline cases in morality especially. But that doesn't mean that there is not right and wrong.
Right. So, Dr. Gopan didn't talk about it in his essay, but another objection that atheists and skeptics and non-believers will present is what's known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Has anybody heard of the Euthyphro dilemma?
Mm-mm.
So the Euthyphro dilemma comes from Plato's The Republic. And in The Republic, Aristotle and his friend Euthyphro are talking about where does goodness come from? It's really the ontology of good, or right and wrong. So the question in their conversation is, does God will something because it is good, or is something good because God wills it? So that's known as the Euthyphro dilemma. A dilemma is a situation where you're forced to choose between two problematic options. You don't know which one to go for. And so this has implications on the ontology of morality, because it places morality somewhere external to God. And so, if God wills something because it is good, then that implies that goodness or morality is something greater than God, which is problematic, right? Or is something good because God wills it? So whatever God says is good, that's good. Well, then that means that God is
Omnipotent?
well, yeah, it is omnipotent, but it's arbitrary.
Yeah.
Because if whatever God wills is good, then God could just say, tomorrow that murder and rape and stealing is good, and suddenly it's good. So it just makes goodness arbitrary. It doesn't really matter. There isn't really a fixed place. It's just it's arbitrary. Does that make sense?
I would counter that argument with God is not arbitrary, and therefore good is not arbitrary.
Right.
God says, I do not change.
So it's a false dilemma, and here's why. Because if we say that something is good, if God wills something because it is good, then, like I said, that places goodness above God. Or if we say that something is good because God wills it, then it becomes arbitrary, because God could just choose anything he wants to be good, and we would be obligated to agree with that. But the reality is it's a false dilemma. Goodness is found in God. An action is good if it comes from God's nature. There was a video I want to show you from On Guard where it actually clarifies this, and it gives a really beautiful illustration of why this is different from this. And I used to be so confused about this because it's like, well, if goodness comes from God, then what's the difference between this and this? And so let's check out this video. Hopefully this comes through the screen.
Let's find out.
Okay, let me restart.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5.
I'd say more.
What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
So, back to the evolutionary argument. I've heard an atheist in a debate arguing that, of course, we've observed progress over time, haven't we? Like we've seen our moral justice and our moral values as a society, as a race of humans progress. They use the word progress over time through evolution, haven't we? Like, why do we need God in order to progress or improve morality? And the problem with that argument is that progress, the word progress, implies a finish line. You're getting closer to a finish line. So progress implies a standard, an objective standard. You wouldn't be justified to say that without an objective standard we've made any progress. All you would say is we've made change. We've changed. Can't have progress without a finish line. You can't make progress on a journey without an actual destination. If you don't have a destination, you haven't made progress. You just changed. Yeah, you just moved. Exactly. You just moved. Your location has changed. So all of this is getting at the existence of God is supported by our ordinary everyday experience of moral values and duties. If God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. But we know very well that moral values and duties do exist. That's the whole basis of the American justice system. That's why we have laws and courts and police officers, and that's why you go to jail when you commit a crime. Like, all of these things exist. Like, it's very real. Like, there are consequences for your actions, independent of just that we simply agreed that it's true. It is true for everyone, no matter what.
I'm going to interject my unique perspective.
Okay.
He said something in that about animals do not have, a morality. I propose that is false. Okay. In Africa, you have leopards and lions existing in the same environment, coexisting. Okay. So, at least from all of our observation, they had similar evolutionary process, similar evolutionary pressures, and so on. Okay, and yet the lions have a morality, a society in which they exist, in which they operate. There are pretty rigid rules within the pride of how they interact. Okay, leopards are almost utterly, completely independent and isolated. They have very little contact with others of their species other than during mating and upbringing. Once they're adults, they live almost completely independently. Okay, similar evolutionary processes and pressures led to completely different outcomes. That indicates that there's something else that endued them, the lions, with this morality, this, if you can call it that. It's similar.
Behavior patterns.
Yeah, but you have a similar thing with wolves versus coyotes. Coyotes are very much independent, and yet they exist and developed in a very similar environment. And so there's no evolutionary explanation for the difference in their behaviors. That indicates that there is something outside of evolution, outside of the physical, that imbued them with these differences, which I think is another argument for, humans developed that. It didn't develop that. That was endued to them.
There's that whole thought though is, I believe that and you believe that. But people who don't believe in God, that's not an option at all. So then they just try and explain it other ways. So it comes down to like
The first premise. If God doesn't exist, then there are no objective morals and moral values and duties. Well, then why? Well, what does God have to do with objective moral values and duties? Can't we get objective moral values and duties from something other than God?
You had mentioned the founding fathers. I'm reading a book about it right now. They have founding fathers, or the founding generation syllogism. It goes concerning religion and public life. Morality is necessary for Republican government. Not Republican as Republican Democrats, but we're a republic, so Republican. Religion is necessary for morality. Therefore, religion is necessary for Republican government. It's a little side thing, but I had read that recently. I thought it was interesting.
You'll have to share that with
Yeah.
Corey before next week.
Oh, yeah.
So, I guess that leads to another question. Can we get moral values and duties? Can we get morality from anything other than God? Or has there been attempts to derive morality from something other than God?
There has been. Communism is a perfect example of that. And it's absolutely utter and complete failure.
What did they try to derive that from?
The individual.
Right. I think it's what Sam Harris argues is stubborn humanism. It's the individual. It's whatever contributes to human flourishing is good, and whatever detracts from it is bad. End of story. I would argue that's probably what communism is rooted in, is just simply whatever contributes to human flourishing is good, and whatever detracts from it is bad. End of
That's an
story.
incongruency though, because how are you defining good and bad?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Right. So
That's the problem.
exactly.
Mhm.
Well, and why?
Who determines what flourishing is?
Yeah, who determines what flourishing is?
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, here, let's. That's exactly what I was going to get to.
Flourishing, then we can say it's objectively good. And if it doesn't, it's objectively evil.
But why think that human flourishing is good? Aren't you being species-centric? Why not refer instead to the flourishing of rats or cabbages?
Well,
And who gets to decide what contributes to human flourishing? Hitler was convinced killing millions of Jews would promote human flourishing. And Margaret Sanger thought forcing poor people to be sterilized would lead to human flourishing.
So who defines what flourishing is and why?
Whoever's in power and
Exactly.
will benefit them
Exactly.
the most.
So it's not really objective then. It becomes subjective, and it becomes arbitrary because you don't have a fixed point of reference for direction.
And even beyond that, just the failures of communism is proof that it's a lie.
Yeah, like in here they mention atheists. Michael Martin argues that theists give the same reasons as atheists for condemning rape. And the first one they give is it violates victims' rights. Well, what are their rights, and where do their rights come
Why? Yeah.
from?
Why are there? Why do they have rights, and why does that matter?
Well, luckily our government defines that.
Yep.
It's enshrined in our doctrine. Our rights are given to us by God, not by the government, and their job is to protect our rights.
They're unalienable. The our government, they're not from our government. If they were from their government, they were from man, that means that man can also take them away. Which is a scary thought.
That's something I talk to my dad a lot, because he's a communist. He doesn't believe that humans have rights, that the government gives them rights. And I'm like, no, It's not how that works.
Then where does the government come from? Like, who is the government if not people?
No, that's the point. They're the people in power. They
Right.
decide.
Right.
But he doesn't see an issue with that, or he didn't used to.
So the response from a Christian perspective to human stubbornism is, or stubborn humanism, stubborn humanism is that, you know, whatever contributes to human flourishing is good, and whatever detracts from it is bad. Well, why humans? Why not, you know, something else like rabbits or rats or cabbages or dogs or whatever? Like, why humans? You know, what makes humans different? I suppose they would probably argue, well, because I'm human. And the other side of it is, well, who gets to decide what contributes to flourishing? Like, how do you define flourishing? Because if your definition of flourishing is just pleasure, then that's not humanism, that's just hedonism.
Well, I could prove that if I take all my neighbor's things, I flourish.
Right. Well, and some people would argue that flourishing, or their idea of pleasure, is pain, because they're into that. They're into pain and suffering because they enjoy pain and suffering. As strange as you might find it, there are people who would argue that flourishing and pleasure is found in pain and suffering.
Yeah, we just talked about that yesterday.
So,
Because I love the pain and suffering. Randy joined in.
so there is one other.
I've run marathons, so I understand that perspective.
We shoveled the whole neighborhood yesterday.
There is one other option. I wouldn't call it a live option, but there is one other option for where you might be able to derive morality, if not from God. And that would be found in Platonism. And Platonism is this idea, moral Platonism is this view that moral values and duties just exist necessarily. They exist like abstract objects, like numbers or sets or shapes or forms, like moral values and duties like justice, love, brotherhood. It's just another abstract object like the ideal cube or the number 2. But the problem with moral Platonism is that if Platonism is true, if moral values and duties exist as these abstract objects, then what about greed and hatred and selfishness? Do those also exist as abstract objects? And if they do exist as abstract objects, then why do we have any obligation to adhere to those? If they're not personal, like, after I die, am I going to have to answer to, the good object? And if I do have to answer to it, then what's the upshot of that? What are the consequences? It's just an abstract object. It's not personal.
What is the good object offering you versus the bad object?
Right. There is no.
And
It's
this
not
male
personal,
definition.
so it doesn't care. It's not like it created me.
It's like you're answerable to that brick.
Right. Exactly. It's
Yeah.
just an object. It's effete. It has no care. It has no mind. It has no. It doesn't care. It's just a thing. So then, again, with Platonism, if Platonism is true and good and evil and right and wrong exist just as abstract objects like the number 2, then we don't really have any accountability or we don't have any obligation to those things, nor to each other. So hopefully this helps. Really what we're getting at isn't so much that objective morality exists, although that's half of the equation. The main thing that we're getting at is that God exists, and here's why. Like, here's our evidence. So the title of this essay was The Moral Argument for God's Existence. We know God exists, and here is evidence to support that. Not that it's necessary, and at no point, in this class do I ever want to lead you down the primrose path that you need evidence to believe in God. That's never been the case.
I would turn that around. We know that moral absolutes exist. Therefore, it's evidence of God's existence.
Right.
Rather than, the way you stated it. I mean, I
Right,
certainly
it's-
agree with
right,
that.
it's like
but-
modus tollens
Yeah.
versus modus ponens.
Yeah.
Like they're both
Yeah.
saying the same thing, but just from
Mhm.
different directions.
Yeah, there's, if we're gonna claim there's objective morality, then it can't come from us, or it has to come from outside of us. So people that claim that there's not a God, then would have to also logically follow there's not objective morality or God. And so, and a lot of them do, and they mention them in here, Jeffrey Dahmer talking about it, and other different atheists. But that's just being intellectually honest. If there's no objective moral reality, then there also cannot be a God.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned Jeffrey Dahmer. I understand, and I don't know the legitimacy of it, but I understand that he became a Christian before he was executed.
Mm-hmm. There recently too.
He changed his mind.
I mean, he had a good point here. He says, if it all happens naturalistically, what's the need for a God? Can I set my own rules? Who owns me? I own myself.
Does everybody know who Jeffrey Dahmer was? Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer who did unspeakable things to his victims.
Including cannibalism.
Yeah, really unspeakable things to his victims. He was murdered in prison, but just before he was murdered, he actually gave his life to Christ, which was a big surprise to a lot of people because he did such unthinkable things. And so it raises this question, is Jeffrey Dahmer in heaven? I think so. And I a little bit off topic here, I point to Jeffrey Dahmer when I read the parable of the vineyard, the workers in the vineyard. You know, Jesus gives a parable about workers that were hired early in the morning, and then there were some more workers that were hired later in the afternoon, and then there were some more workers that were hired like just with 1 hour left in the day. And then when everybody came to get their pay, the owner paid everybody equally. And everybody's like, whoa, hey, that's not fair. You know, I worked since sunrise this morning, and you're giving him, who only worked 1 hour, the same amount of money as me? What? I imagine there are probably going to be Christians who get to heaven and they see Jeffrey Dahmer, and they're like, this dude did such horrible things, and, you know, I gave my life to you. You know, I spent hours in, you know, service and in worship and in prayer, and I read the Bible 50 times, like, and he got in? So...
And this is, if we don't acknowledge that there is objective morals, that's where it leads into relativism. Relativism is the idea that your truth and my truth, and much of that statement itself is not true, but it can't be true. But that's where it leads. That's the path that leads down if there is no objective morals.
That used to really stump me. In fact, I had a debate with a coworker one time where he was like, "Well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. Maybe that's true for you, but that's not true for me." And it just stopped me in my tracks. I was like, what do I say to that? Like, I don't have a response for that. And I'm here to tell you that there is an easy answer to that.
Before you give yours, can I give mine?
Mm-hmm.
I like to take their logic and apply it in a ridiculous argument. Be like, I understand what you're saying. It's just like everyone says the earth is round. I know that it's flat. You know, it might be your truth that it's round, but my truth is that it's flat. We could both be right. And if they're a rational person, they realize how dumb their argument is, because I just made the same one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so what you just did there is called argument ad absurdum, where you take a conclusion or take an argument to its logical conclusion and show how absurd it is by applying its own logic to itself. And so the answer to that is, well, is that true? If someone says, well, maybe that's true for you, but that's not true for me, can something be true for you and not true for me? Well, let's apply that question to itself. So it's what's known as a self-refuting statement.
Yep.
Or a paradox, I
It's
suppose.
an art I've mastered.
So, I'm trying to think of another example. I just had it on the tip of my tongue.
Well, what did you come back with to your coworker?
I didn't, because I at that point I hadn't been taught, the idea of self-refuting statements. So another example of a self-refuting statement is that there are no English sentences if there are no English sentences that contain more than one word. Well, that in itself is an English sentence that contains more than one word. So it's a self-refuting argument. So when someone says that, well, that's true for you, but that's not true for me, obviously that doesn't apply to itself, because if it did, it would make itself false.
And so following the objective versus subjective, if they go, there is no objective morals, they're claiming objectivity. They're saying,
Yeah, they're appealing to that as an objective truth, true for everyone, always, everywhere, no matter what. Which makes it self-refuting.
Always works. Every time.
I would caution you on that. I don't disagree with using that tactic, but
Depends on who you're talking to.
exactly
Their intelligence level.
exactly. Depending on who you're talking to, you could really offend someone and just piss them off, and then they'll just shut you down and walk away.
Well, Randy knows that I'm a pretty funny guy. I work with intelligent people.
Yeah.
Not too long ago, I was on a trip with one of my coworkers. He's our engineer, and he mentioned I'm not really against abortion, so I come at him with, yeah, me neither, man. Honestly, we should really expand everyone's rights, because we have all these senior citizens not contributing to the economy. We've got all these 18-year-olds that won't get jobs. Abort them.
Yeah.
And he's like, what? I'm like, yeah, they're not viable people. And he's intelligent, so he realizes what I'm getting at. But also, my delivery is impeccable, so he was crying laughing. But I made him admit that, no, we are killing people. These aren't fetuses, which they are. Fetus is a small person.
Sean McDowell, I'm sure some of you guys probably heard of him, but he has a list of some good ones. Like, there is no truth.
Oh, self-refuting statements. Yeah. Yeah, these are good.
Yeah, you should not judge. Or,
When someone says you shouldn't judge other people, they are themselves guilty of the crime they're accusing you. Sorry, go ahead.
Let's hear him.
yeah, the scientific method is the only means of knowing truth.
Can you test that scientifically?
Yeah.
How?
History is unknowable.
Mm.
You should be tolerant of views not your own. Language cannot carry meaning.
Sometimes I feel that way about English.
Depends on who's speaking.
You should not force your morals on others.
Yeah.
Are you forcing that moral?
Yeah, you shouldn't tell people what to do.
Are you telling me what to do?
I've really chosen to embrace determinism.
Keyword freely.
Yeah.
I have chosen to believe in Calvinism.
Yes, I was going to say that, yeah. Good stuff.
Well, shall we take a look at what we'd like to discuss for next week? I hope this has been helpful and not like drinking from a fire hose. Hope it's been edifying and useful.
Naturalism as a worldview, number 4, is caught my eye.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm open to other possibilities. Or we could go to number 6. It's kind of follow on what we're talking about today.
Oh, responding to the problem of evil. Yeah, I would highly recommend following the problem of evil by, or following the moral argument for God's existence with problem of evil, because they go hand in hand.
I feel like we did cover it though.
We did in On Guard. Mm-hmm.
Well, no, just now.
Oh yeah,
Define
a little bit.
evil,
A little
right?
bit.
It's
Right.
the same concept.
Yeah,
You just
exactly.
replace some of the words of everything we talked about.
It had never occurred to me until I saw. I was telling Randy before class that it never occurred to me until I saw a debate with David Wood that when someone complains about the existence of evil and suffering in the world, what they're doing is they're admitting that there is a way things ought to be. And so they have to implicitly concede morality. And unless God exists, there is no morality. There is no way things ought to be. So yeah, when you get into a debate with someone about the problem of evil and suffering, you should point it out to them that before we begin, you have to admit that there is a right and wrong, there is a good and a bad, there is a way things ought to be. And I agree, the world is a very messed up place. It's very, there are a lot of problems, but it's not a problem unless you admit that there is a way things should be.
Once again, I like taking the position of the contrarian. What evil?
Yeah, right. Evil? What's that? Yeah, the problem of evil would be perfect to follow up after.
I like making people make my argument to me for me. Explain evil. Like, there's no such thing as evil. And they're like, don't you believe in right and wrong?
What was that in tactics? It was what he's talking about is it taking the roof off, or is it? I'm trying to remember. It's the one where you take an argument for a test drive and see how it goes. I'm trying to remember. I think it's taking the roof off. I'm pretty sure that's the tactic. But anyway,
so I found a Rabbi's talking about it. That's sure, so we don't have to watch the whole video. So Rabbi Zacharias was another apologist. He's passed away now, but he says, when you say there's too much evil in this world, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. But if you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. But that's who you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question?
yeah.
Yeah, this is just kind of off topic a little bit, but it's just been interesting last about a week ago or so. I was thinking about my life and just I literally cannot picture my life without God.
Divided.
I'm sorry.
And there's just I can't picture it. I can't envision what that would look like even. And it was just interesting how, for me to see, to kind of reinforce just my understanding of God's omnipresence and God's influence in my life. It was just kind of interesting just to think about that and ponder that. It's interesting. Pervasive.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a way that we experience God. Similarly to how we experience morality is by counting your blessings and just observing all the little ways that God has revealed himself in your life through people and circumstances and things like that. Yeah.
I found an interesting fact yesterday, and I was telling them, I told a bunch of other people, I'm telling you guys. So Thanksgiving, as we know it, at least when I grew up and when I've been told, it's kind of like, of course, being thankful for the first harvest or the Indians and being thankful for things and etc. The first actual Thanksgiving proclamation was given by George Washington, and it was purely about being thankful to God. If you read a proclamation, it's fantastic. That's all it's about. Mm-hmm. And how he's provided for us, and how we need to think about the bad sins we've done, and how Christ died for us and all that stuff. I'm like, what? And then it wasn't a federal holiday till later, but they had many. So like in the spring they had proclamations of prayer. So the government would actually have the proclaimed days of prayer and humiliation, and humility, or something. And then in the fall they would have Thanksgiving. And most presidents did that. There's a couple that didn't. And then eventually ended up becoming a federal holiday. But yeah, it's completely lost its meaning now.
It's been culturally appropriated.
Yes. So I read that yesterday. I was like, what? That's freaking dope.
Another thing that's kind of interesting is Lincoln proclaimed a day of prayer and fasting.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I believe, the next day that Gettysburg took place. And that was a turning point in the Civil War.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much good stuff. I think if you haven't read this one, oh yeah, I think you'd like it.
So where we land on what we want to read for next week?
That one that we talked about last.
Responding to the argument.
Well, there's three. Two of them are David Wood and one is Bruce Little. We could also do 2 essays, but that might also be too much. Were we looking at the 6th, the Responding to the Argument from Evil, 3 Approaches for the Theist by David Wood?
I'm open to whatever. I don't have a strong point right now.
Boy, two essays in the philosophy section in a row. I feel spoiled.
Yeah, that was a good one because it kind of has some of the other stuff within it. So.
David Wood's testimony is pretty incredible. He has a video on YouTube telling his story, his testimony. And for one, it's 30 minutes long and it's one uncut, unedited take. The whole thing is just a 30-minute single take, never cut, no edits, just one long take of him talking to you while riding the subway in New York. So like he basically commutes from one place to another on the subway while telling you his story. But his story is also really incredible. He is a diagnosed psychopath. So he has no empathy. He actually murdered his father with a hammer, or attempted murder. I'm trying to remember if he killed him or if I think he succeeded in killing him. And so he served time in prison. And while he was in prison, he met a Christian who was praying and reading his Bible, and they got into a fasting war. Because he was an atheist, he wanted to make fun of the Christian, and so he got into a fasting competition with a Christian, this Christian guy. He did it just to try to make fun of him, but everything he tried to make fun of this guy for, he had answers. Like everything, he's like, oh, well, if you believe in God, then what about blah 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 blah? And every single thing that he tried to make fun of this guy for, he had answers, and it challenged his worldview, and he actually discovered Christ, got saved in prison, and then earned his doctorate in theology while in prison, and now
He's a psychopath.
Yeah, and he's a psychopath. Yeah, and now he's a prominent Christian apologist, and he wrote 2 of the essays in this book, the Responding to the Argument from Evil, and then God, Suffering, and Santa Claus. I wonder if one or both of them might include pieces of his testimony. I don't know, but his story is incredible.
Wow.
Like he talks about how like he met this Christian in prison, and all he wanted to do was make fun of him, and he got into a fasting war with him, and found God. So
It's interesting. I was reading the other day, reading some stuff, or had some podcast from David Tour, who's a synthetic chemist. And it was interesting. He wasn't, he's Messianic Jew, but it was interesting. He wasn't interested in biology or any of that sort of stuff, but he was, a PhD chemist, brilliant, one of the most brilliant chemists in his field, and he kept hearing about people talking about origin of life, and the things they were saying, he knew from experience were absolute utter nonsense, and he got pulled into the discussion through his knowledge and just seeing the absurdity of the claims, and that's how he got involved and became quite the prominent apologist for creationism. Through that, I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah.
His pathway into that.
Well, before we conclude, are there any other questions or thoughts about the moral argument? I'm really looking forward. I was just peeking at next week's essay, and this has got a lot of syllogisms. So hopefully that sunk in about like what syllogisms are and how they work. Because just peeking ahead at this week's essay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 syllogisms. So that'll be good to get through. So no. All right. Would anybody like to close this in prayer?
I will. Dear God, we thank you so much for just your patience with us. God, we just thank you that you came to rescue us, and that you came to help us to not only overcome our sins, but to become the people that you want us to be. That because of you, we can flourish and know what that is, and really become what you intended. And we're so grateful, so thankful. We thank you for these proofs and just this discussion that allows us to hopefully represent you better to others, and to help to defend your name and to glorify you through our discussions. And we just pray this all through Christ. Amen.
Amen.